Yes, so first I would like to share a little bit about kind of what brings me here and why I'm kind of passionate about sharing more about archetypes today and especially the Greek goddesses. So what is really, we're gonna dive deep into the biggest inspiration for me is this book, and it's Goddesses in Every Woman by Jean Shinona Bolen. And basically, what she has created is this kind of movement. And you could say it's really this movement that really brought under intention women's psychology. So to not only see psychology from a very masculine perspective, which you kind of see as like which are known as like the bigger fathers in psychology. Most well known is Freud and Jung. So today we're going more in Jungian psychology, and who throughout his career at some point separated a little bit more from the ideas from Freud. But what is most well known and what they really had in common and what actually agreed on is about the importance of the unconscious and also the symbolic meaning of dreams. And what it all is, we're going to go a little bit more into. But when I started to go deeper into Jungian psychology, it was about 10 years ago, I think now already. And I just started to read about it. I learned a bit more about what the shadow was and the unconscious was. And also, what really interests me a lot was the concept of synchronicity that he introduced, so that we have meaningful coincidences. And at that time, I was experiencing a lot of meaningful coincidences. So, yeah, it really changed my understanding of how kind of life, the inner and outer world, are constantly communicating. And I found that very interesting, and especially when we're moving through a lot of changes in our life, or even what Carl Jung called a spiritual emergency. So instead of seeing mental health problems as like a crisis where something has really gone wrong, the perspective of Jung was to see it more as a cracking open. So that suddenly there is a big abrupt change in our life, and it's going to be internally or externally, that is going to be a driver for change. And in some ways, it can also be divinely orchestrated. So then, after studying a bit more the work of men and also later more the work of Joseph Campbell, going deeper into mythology, my mother gave me this book. And it kind of really brought these interests together. And the author, Jean Shinonda Bolen, she is a Jungian psychiatrist. So she has studied medicine and psychology and really integrated the meaning of Greek mythology and the archetypes into her work. And she wrote the book really from the perspective that everyone can understand it. And what she really wanted to bring to the attention, especially more in the academic world and the world of psychology, is to really see the difference in women's psychology and men's psychology. And she basically uses the Greek archetypes and the Greek goddesses as a tool for that. And that from that success, so this is already probably 30 years or more that the book was published. So from that success, she also wrote the gods in every man. So then it's going into the male archetypes. And then later, as kind of also revisiting and deepening her own journey, going to menopause and becoming older of age, she wrote the goddesses in older women. Uh, and there she also looks back at the previous book. So that's really where a lot of my knowledge and wisdom is kind of based on that I'm going to be sharing today. And since then, I've always continued my interest in myth and in psychology. And I always look at it more from an alternative perspective as well, because my main experience has been more in alternative therapies and also integrating spirituality and shamanism into my ways of working. And what I love about it, it's perfectly aligns with the kind of the way Jim Bolan writes as well. because she really weaves in spirituality as an important part and aspect of women's life, while remaining also very grounded and rooted. And I think that brings it together very beautifully. So we're going to kind of start at the beginning today and then kind of move into meeting the Greek goddesses. So having kind of a wonderful meeting and introduction. So I'm just going to bring up the images and share my screen. So here again, this is a book. So Goddesses in Every Woman by Jean Sunonna Bolin. Sometimes you may see my volume go up and down. It does that spontaneously. I don't know what is happening today with that. But we're just gonna keep on going. So kind of a little bit of an overview, what I would love to share with you today. Basically, we're going to go into the transformative power of archetypes, and especially relating it to women's life. And first, I want to explain a little bit about what are archetypes really, right? So, what is the phenomena of archetypes? And then I want to share a little bit about the difference between the personal and the collective unconscious. And then we're going to go into a little bit more the feminine and masculine, and also from an inner perspective. And then we're going to move into the feminine archetypes and the Greek goddesses, where again, we're going to look at kind of this is the archetype, so this is the goddess, and then see how does it relate to women's psychology, so we can really make that connection to our inner lives. And what I would invite you to do is to, in this process, to see like what are the goddesses and the archetypes you naturally resonate most with, so that you see like, oh, I recognize myself a lot in this. And again, it be the light and shadow attributes. Often it's a mixture. And also to see, okay, what archetype actually feels most distant. So often the archetypes that are closest to us and that we feel are furthest away from us, or that are more suppressed within us, is actually where we can learn the most from. So that's something to kind of keep with you as we move forward. So first we're going to start with what are archetypes. So in the Western world, Carl Jung brought the idea of archetypes to us. That doesn't mean that archetypes didn't exist before they did. So archetypes have existed since the beginning of time, and they've always been there. Often we call these symbolic meanings. These can be characters, or these can be stories, myths that continue to return in different ways, in different forms. And also what Jean Bolin said, that myths are not something that happened, but it's something that's always happening. And the same is with archetypes. So archetypes is not something that we see once or twice, but it continues to come back. And it can, like I say in symbolism, different figures. It can be through, we can even see animals as archetypes, especially in the shamanic world. That's something that comes back very strongly. So even nature and its symbolism can also be seen as archetypes as well. And today we're mainly going to go deeper into to see the archetypes in mythology. So the way Jung described it is that archetypes are universal patterns of thought and behavior that reside in the collective unconscious. So what does that mean is that these archetypes they're like universal patterns, so they're not personal to us. They're not even personal to one culture, but it comes back throughout different cultures. And the same thing we're going to see in myth is that in different mythological traditions, we can find similar archetypes. So, for example, in Greek mythology, Demeter is the mother of the grain. So she is the archetype of the mother goddess. And Isis in the Egyptian mythology is also mother goddess and goddess of the grain. And then, of course, these cultures were connected. But if we go way further away and even look at other cultures, we'll also see a mother goddess. For example, in South America, you have Pachamama, and also in Mexico, there are different goddesses that look over the harvest. So this is a way of just an example of different archetypes. And they're universal because they're not unique to one place or one culture or one person. So we can all, no matter where we are and who we are, encounter these archetypes. So they can be seen through images, but also through thinking patterns and behavioral patterns. So the way these archetypes show up in our lives can be in different ways, so more subtle and more strong. And Jung believed that archetypes provide a map to a deeper understanding of the psyche. And so, what basically Jung in his practice, where he mainly worked for a long time, also with himself, he used it for deeper inner inquiry, but also with the clients and people he worked with. He used basically archetypes almost as this doorway into the unconscious. So we have an opening, and this can be a story or an image, and that can actually allow us to go a little deeper. So it's almost like archetypes can be used as a thread that takes us deeper into our inner world. And then it kind of guides us through a process where we can leave with new insights, or we can activate or understand something that we didn't understand before. And what he calls primordial images are images that are not limited to a specific place in time. So primordial then means kind of what I said before, like from the very beginning. So Jung believed that archetypes have always been there, and we're just kind of tapping into it. So archetypes is what he names it, the label he put on it, but it's always been here. And what then he says about the foundational structure of the human psyche is that actually these archetypes are essential. So it's almost are like the building blocks of what later becomes a personality, but that's more the forefront of who we are. But it's almost when we look at the deeper parts of ourselves, these archetypes are everywhere, really. And so we see it come back very strongly in myth, but in religion, but also whenever cultures pay attention to dreams, you will see all kinds of different archetypes return. It's also important to know that often in today's world, when it comes to mental health, psych or psychology is often kind of modernly translated more as mind in the sense of our mental health. But originally in Greek, and also how Jung meant it, is really to see the psyche as the soul, or kind of as the life within us that is connected to everything in existence. So we cannot really, and this was his perspective too, we cannot really look at individual health without taking in the context of the culture, the environment, but also these deeper forces that influence us. So it makes it a little bit more complex, but it also makes it very interesting when we actually kind of understand the basis of what he meant, and that we can then kind of build further on, because it's kind of like this information, once we kind of get it, we can continue to keep it with us, because it kind of changes the way we look at our own inner world, but also the way we look at the outer world and other people. So I would love to explain a little bit more about what the unconscious really is. So we have the conscious mind, which is kind of like our focus. It's a bit more like a flashlight. So our conscious mind is conscious of the things we're looking at and focusing on right now. So it is important for us to kind of get the task done and to focus really. And then another thing that is important to know about the conscious mind, it's often kind of also encapsulates everything we already know. So it's in our realm of knowing, it's in our realm of comfort, it's kind of everything we are aware of. That's kind of part of our conscious mind. And everything happening under the surface that we're not aware of is part of the unconscious. And then we have a collective unconscious. So then we're talking about what I talked about earlier, the realm of dreams, of myth, of religion, of a bigger, wider human culture. Then we're talking about the collective. And the personal unconscious is basically our personal memories, but memories that we don't consciously remember. So this is often when we go into regression therapy, or we do deeper meditations, or like kind of inner journey work. That's kind of also when a lot of material from both the personal and the collective unconscious comes up. But these are not just memories in image memories. The unconscious also contains deeper feelings, emotions. It can be even buried dreams, buried gifts we have. But it can also be unprocessed pain. So it's not negative or positive, it beholds both. And yeah, so it's kind of like the personal and the collective are both part of the unconscious. So and in the moment we kind of become aware of something, then actually it's no longer part of the unconscious because it's brought to our conscious awareness. So what is conscious and what is unconscious is kind of continuously changing. And it happens on a personal level, but also on a collective level. When we look at a culture, for example, now we live in a time of where there's so much information. So a lot of things we didn't know a few decades ago, now it's kind of broadly spread. And these can also be things that are good for us, bad for us, or in history. All these different things are kind of then coming from the collective unconscious and then become conscious. And what that process of making the unconscious conscious does is that it actually opens up a transformative process, because once we know something and once we see something and our perspective changes, also our behavior changes, and how we move forward from that place of knowing and understanding. And then is also important differentiation to make between the persona and then the soul or the self, kind of the essence of ourself. So when we talk about the soul and when Jung talks about the self, it's really this essence, this core of who we are that's a lot deeper. And then the body is more kind of the home for the soul, so to speak. And the persona is more the mask we wear. So also the word persona comes from mask. And it's part of the conscious mind. And it's kind of what is at the forefront. So it's often our personality, like, hi, I'm Sanne, and this is where I live, this is what I do. And kind of that self, with that part of myself, that's actually not my authentic self in the soul and the essence, but it's more the persona. It's kind of, and you could kind of see the persona as a car, you know? It's not really who we are. It's more we get into car to kind of navigate life, to get from A to B. There's this practical function for it. But when we return to our essence, we don't actually, the persona is not really a reflection of who we truly are. It has a lot more to do with our conditioning and who we've been kind of conditioned to be. And also it's a bit of like a coping and surviving of, it's kind of the persona consciously checks in how it's perceived by others, because that's kind of the surviving. I mean, is more social survival in trying to fit in, not wanting to receive a negative or shameful response. So the persona is kind of conditioned to avoid social risks. So it would kind of wear what wouldn't cause as much reactions from others, for example. Um, so it's a lot more. The persona can also be about being perceived as good. It's also a very important part, and it's kind of also of what is called a bit more our ego. So the ego and the persona are both kind of systems in place that help us to survive, and not only on a physical level, which is more the primal ego, but the persona is more about our social survival. And Jung believed that actually, and that's the mask, it actually conceals the true nature of the individual. So that sometimes we mistake the persona for who we are because we really begin to believe that story, like, I am this who does this. And but actually, in essence, those are things that can just change very easily, and it doesn't behold the essence of who we are. And the soul is a bit more complex. It's actually a very complex system in the sense where it bridges. So it bridges our conscious self, so the persona, and the unconscious parts. And so, in that way, the soul is kind of more all compassing in that context. And in the Red Book, which is kind of one of Jung's most well known books, he refers to the soul as a living and self existing being. So the soul is whole and complete on its own. And the Red Book, he also created a lot of paintings and images, even though he never saw himself as an artist. I think also when we go back, this is one of the paintings that he made. So he also studied mandalas very well when it's relation to archetypes, because he started to make mandalas a lot, and later started to one of the first Westerners to start to study also more Eastern philosophies and different cultures. He also studied with Toltec shamans as well, and I think also in North Africa. And he also said that everyone has a red book in them. And for him, the red book is more that expression of the soul, of dreams, and our deeper meaning and story, instead of kind of the story of the persona. And these are two drawings I made this year. And it's as a part of a drawing program that I am following. And these are actually the first portraits, self portraits I've made. And the reason why I decided to bring it in, because it is a perfect example of a bit more of the persona and of the soul expression when we kind of weave in archetypes. So kind of the persona, the first portrait, is more like a mirror image of the first thing I see when I look at myself in the mirror, and trying to create a realistic portrait from that. And the second portrait has been a lot more an intuitive, instinctual process. So I started with just looking at myself, and then I started to see different things and images and symbols almost like onto the paper. And then in the process, kind of these images became clear. So at some point, I saw a bird, and then I saw these threads. And then when I completed it, I was like, oh, I actually see this strong archetype in what I've created. And the archetype that I saw then was kind of the goddess, it's not a Greek goddess, but actually Celtic goddess Morrigan, who is associated with ravens, and she's kind of a warrior goddess. So it kind of, and that's not something I thought of when I was creating it. And this is also how the way Jung means it. It's almost something that we see in hindsight. So it's also something we're going to do with the Greek goddesses. We're going to kind of see it in hindsight, like, oh, now we start to see these archetypes in different ways. So before we move into the goddesses, the last thing I want to share with you, kind of going a little bit deeper into Jungian psychology, because it is important, is going into what Jung called the animus and the anima. And in modern language, this is often called the inner masculine and the inner feminine, especially in more the new age and kind of the meditation communities, also in yoga. These are very kind of well-known terms. But the way Jung meant it in psychology was that actually every woman has within her, so within her unconscious, a masculine energy or a masculine figure and archetype, and that every man has within himself a feminine archetypes within his unconscious, and that actually through deeper inner work, a man can get to know his inner feminine, and a woman can get to know his inner masculine. So he really saw it more from these gender roles. And the way and how his theories became very popular is when it comes to more in relationships. So Jung believed, if we look at more from the heterosexual perspective, and you can always adjust it later, but the way he meant it during that time was that, for example, if a woman meets a man, it activates and she falls in love with him, it will activate her inner masculine. And also the other way around with the man, it will activate his inner feminine, the unconscious forces of the inner feminine. And on the one hand, then the inner feminine and masculine is this collective archetypes, which is kind of more embodied by the goddesses and the gods. But it also brings up the strongest men and women archetypes within us, and that's our mother and our father. So, and that's also where the idea comes from the animus and the anima, that we project kind of our mother or our father onto our partner. So that's kind of what kind of came through the understanding of the animus and anima. So the way Bolan sees it is a bit more from a feminine perspective. So what she believes, and is also kind of commonly accepted, and the way I see it as well, is that we both have an inner masculine and feminine, no matter what our gender is, and that we can also project both our mother and our father onto our partner, so that it's not as separate gender wise, but it's a bit more fluid. And why is that important to know today? So, aside from the feminine goddesses, also we also have an inner masculine archetypes. So it can always be interesting after we've explored more deeply the archetypes of the goddesses or of women to then move forward to exploring the archetypes of men. And then we can also actually have a lot of different discoveries through that process alone. And because sometimes actually exploring also masculine archetypes can also be very insightful. And what we also see and notice that in some women, actually, they naturally already have a stronger masculine presence within us, and the same the other way around. So that's why we're now moving into a time where gender, especially from a psychological perspective and from an energetic perspective, and the way we express ourselves is more fluid. But I do believe that having the kind of the names of masculine and feminine does help to kind of give name to it and to see it through that polarity, which we see, of course, also in the yin and yang symbol. So that's kind of a bit more like the basic of Jungian psychology. So we can then kind of move forward into a deeper understanding of how we can use these archetypes to lead to deeper insights within ourselves. And we'll also notice is that we'll notice that certain archetypes are strongly embodied by our mother, for example, or by family members that have a strong influence in us. And that's also very interesting to look at. So as we kind of move into the Greek goddesses, Jean Bolin, she kind of put them into different categories, which I'll also explain a bit more later, which is the virgin goddesses. And the virgin goddesses, what is important to know, it's not only about virginity in the sense of not having sex, but even though with some goddesses it is part of it, like celibacy is more part of those goddesses, but virgin is mainly meant as a woman unto herself. So also when we look at it back from the perspective kind of the time, like of ancient Greece, that, for example, women didn't have a right for ownership. But if, for example, their father actually made them independent, so his daughter wasn't going to marry and he was okay with it, it meant that she could actually have ownership and make decisions without needing permission from a man. So that's also kind of, that's why virgin is also kind of symbolizes independence or a woman unto herself, which doesn't need kind of an, is not dependent on a man, basically. So that's the context of that. And then the vulnerable goddesses, on the other hand, they are vulnerable in the sense that their status or their archetype is dependent upon others. So they're not kind of completely sovereign on just themselves. Their well-being and their existence depends on either a man or their role as a woman, or they're codependent in some way. And then the alchemical goddess Aphrodite, she's kind of like in between. So she is unto herself in a way. She makes her own decisions, and she kind of goes where she wants to go, and kind of lives her own life in her own unique way, you could say. But at the same hand, she's dependent where relationships are very important to her, and her connections with others do impact her well-being very much. But she's not completely dependent either. And in the grown goddess Hecate, she's more like an older woman, a wise woman. So she is neither actually. She could be closest to a chemical goddess, but often crone goddess is a little bit more withdrawn from the world and what is happening kind of out in the arena or on Earth or in Olympus. So when we're kind of meeting these goddesses, these are all, except Hecate, who was already there earlier, which I'll get into later. But the rest are all Olympian goddesses. So that means that they are connected to Zeus, which is kind of the big father god. And yeah, the parents kind of Zeus, but also his sisters, for example, Hera, and you also have Hestia. Their parents are Kronos and Rhea. And the parents of Kronos and Rhea, if we kind of go into the family tree, then you also have Uranus and Gaia. Now, of course, Gaia is the earth goddess, and then Uranus is more the masculine force. So you kind of have all these different generations, and the Olympian gods and goddesses are most well known. It's also probably most of you are also familiar with the Olympics, which most of them play an important role in too. And then the first goddess we're going to meet is Artemis, and Artemis is the goddess of the hunt. And Artemis belongs to the virgin goddesses. And that's because she's very independent. It's kind of, if I look at Artemis, she is the woman who can kind of live in the wild on her own. Is a woman who would go on her own camping in nature and not be afraid at all. So she's associated with lots of different animals. You're talking about stories about bears, wolves, deers, wild boars. So she really is a huntress. So she's kind of a wild woman, you could say. And the huntress, the way also Jean Bolin really translated to her life, is a woman who is very goal-oriented. So in modern life, these are often competitive athletes, really fall often under the huntress Artemis, especially who are really emotionally invested as well. So kind of who can, get really angry when they lose or things don't really go their way. That's a typical Artemis. In the stories, Artemis is known as the archer, so that's why you also see in the statue She has, now you don't see her bow, but you see also kind of the arrows. So Artemis is kind of the maiden aspect also of kind of the moon goddesses when we set our intentions. So, and when we set our intentions, we set our goals and we don't stray away from them. So Artemis, what is her gift is her focus. Is it's her ability to see the target and go directly after it. So she's also an incredibly fast runner. And there are also different stories about that. Unfortunately, I don't have the time to go into it all. Another important aspect of Artemis is her importance of sisterhood. This is really something specific to her, where in every story she was always surrounded by, it's called in Greek mythology, nymphs. So these are all these kind of, you could see them more as young maiden women, if we would kind of translate them, who would just accompany her. So these are kind of also women at the heart of kind of women's community who kind of have some to strongly take initiative and kind of gather everyone together. And you know, if we would go back to the example, I once met this very strong Artemis woman when I was camping in the wild in Sweden with a group of women. And she would just take the initiative. She would know kind of all the ways of the wild, and she would kind of like introduce all the women into, you know, how to kind of live together. So it's Artemis has this very strong leadership ability of bringing together women and really having that confidence as well, and really also giving women the confidence that we can also live and survive on our own without necessarily needing men, which again makes her really this virgin goddess. So Artemis is actually not that interested in men often, or in romantic relationships, especially not marriage. So she's definitely not a traditional woman by those values. And what is good to know is that usually when we talk about archetypes, we're rarely ever dominated just by one archetype. Usually what we see is that we kind of have a palette, like of different colors, of different archetypes that are strongest in our life. And when we say someone is dominated by it or it's the strongest influence, it's kind of the archetype that's most at the forefront in their life. But often when you look deeper at someone and the better you get to know them, you'll see that they're a mixture of different archetypes. And actually, when we talk about psychological health, it's actually healthiest to have different archetypes instead of kind of being ruled by just one, because then also the difficulties often become stronger. Another important attribute of Artemis is that she's a moon goddess. She's also a twin. Her twin brother is Apollo, which is a sun god. And she was the firstborn. And after she was born, she already aided her mother, Leto, in the birth of her little twin brother. So through already when she was just born, she already helped deliver her mother a baby. And from that moment on, she became the goddess of childbirth. So whenever there was any difficulty during births, or the women could call on Artemis. And also that's why also the archetype of Artemis can be very strong in midwives. So it's that same kind of wildness and confidence also within the body. So you could say that Artemis is very body oriented. She lives in her body. And also her body is kind of most important to her. And yeah, so what's also interesting to know is that when women get their periods, there used to be rites of passage, also dedicated to the goddess Artemis, where younger girls would actually sacrifice their old dolls to the goddess Artemis and toys that they used. So they would either sacrifice it to the fire or bury it. It's kind of that transition of age when women begin to bleed. And there are also kind of ceremonies where women would actually act like little girls who started to get their periods, would actually act like little bears because also Artemis is linked to the bear in many different ways. And also women's health and women's birth is also linked to the cycle of the bear. And unfortunately, I don't have the time to go deeper into that today. But Artemis is a very interesting goddess to explore with many different faces. So she is definitely an archetype and a woman who you cannot pin down. So I think that's an attribute of her. The difficulties this archetype uh, how it kind of comes into expression in women's life, where it can be very challenging, is an emotional distance. So Artemis is kind of that wild type. It's like the moment people kind of get close, she kind of disappears and vanishes, or she creates a distance. She would kind of be the type to maybe ghost someone after they come too close. So an emotional distance can be there, not wanting to depend on others, or especially being not wanting to get married. So when anything comes in that area of relationship, Artemis has the tendency to vanish, or also not really the type to speak about her emotions at all, not wanting to rely on others. So any form of dependency is kind of seen as weakness for a woman who is strongly influenced by Artemis. She also has very destructive elements of rage. So it can make her a very powerful athlete in some ways, or lead to strong physical abilities, her anger and her rage, but it can also be very destructive in her relationship. So in a woman, it can be a woman who is overcome by rage in a moment and she loses control of herself. Also, when Artemis feels disrespected, she can take revenge and sometimes very out of proportion. So kind of punish people in way worse ways than they actually deserve. So those are kind of more shadow elements of Artemis. And then we also have the other virgin goddess, Athena. And Athena is the goddess of war, wisdom, and craft. Athena is also a virgin goddess, but the way she has some similarities with Artemis, where she's strongly independent, for example, but the way it comes to expression is very different. So Athena is very intellectual and very head up. So it's a woman who really lives in her head, often who can study very well. So these are often women who pursue a more academic career. They often climb the career ladder very well, very quickly. Are often fathers, daughters, who easier get along with men than women. So that's a big difference with Artemis. In that way, they're kind of opposites. So an Athena woman has no problem working with just men. So you can also see an Athena woman in the military, for example, higher up, or in the police forces, for example, when she's more a strategist. So Artemis is very more physical, so she would do more active work, for example, as well. But an Athena woman is very in the mind. But she is a warrior goddess. So when she was born, and her birth story is a little strange, but she was actually born from the head of her father. I'm not going to go to the exact story right now, but she was born fully in armor. And that also says something very important about Athena, that she's actually a very guarded woman. So she knows how to protect herself. Similar to Artis, she doesn't like vulnerability. That's actually something she stays away from. So But she is a very strong warrior goddess, where especially when it comes to strategy, she's the best at it. And strategy, she's better than the man, actually. So in that way, Athena actually receives respect from men because of her cleverness and intelligence. Also, very important to know, and this is also one of ways of her cleverness as well, is a woman who can create wealth very well. And also Athena, and of course the city, the capital city, Athens, is named after her. And the way the story goes that she won the heart from the people, for the people, was because she gifted the people olive tree branches that they could plant. And then the olive trees would grow and they would give the people massive amount of wealth. Even like rich olive oil is called liquid gold. So Athena was kind of responsible for the wealth of the whole of Greece, and that's how she became loved. And that's actually how she won the battle to become kind of the most revered goddess in the biggest city. And she won that from Poseidon, who's more the sea god, because the sea is very important. But actually, Athena won the competition with her cleverness. And also in Athens, you see a very old olive tree. It's not the original tree, but still the olive tree is really honored in her name and preserved. And when there is no war, so when everything is more peaceful, an Athena woman will spend time doing craft. So, really kind of intentionally working on something like weaving is kind of what she's best known for, to be the best weaver, which is a very task that we have need to have focus, persistence, and patience for. So yeah, Athena is the best craft woman. And then it's not as much in creativity, which will later go into with Aphrodite, where it's really this passionate creating. Crafting is more like this mindful, okay, this is something I'm just going to focus on and I'm going to work on step by step. And I'm going to see it come together. And that's more the craft that's under the realm of Athena. Well, what I mentioned already, the difficulties a little bit. So the difficulties is her armoredness. So an Athena woman has very strong defenses, and it doesn't like to be in touch with her emotions very well. Also in conversations, when this can be when someone has a very strong defenses and maybe always wants to be the one who's right, kind of. That armor can actually lead to not being in touch with her feelings. So it can even lead to numbness because she spent too much time up in her head. And another difficulty she can experience is rejecting her own inner feminine in general, and also not being able to form friendships very well with other women. And there are also different stories where Tina kind of did not really act on the behalf of other women, but actually in the opposite of that. So when it comes to more the patriarchy and the matriarchy, Athena is a father's daughter who sides with the patriarchy for sure. And then we're moving to the last virgin goddess, which is Hestia. And the energy of Hestia is very different than of Athena and of Artemis. And Hestia is a lot more about the heart, about the hearth, and returning to our center. So when it comes to the Greek goddesses, Hestia is definitely the most spiritual archetype, and that's why she's the goddess of the hearth and the temple. So when we look at women's lives, women who devote their lives either to a religion, like to the church, to become a nun, or who become a priestess at the temple and devote their lives to spiritualities, these are women who are strongly dominated by Hestia, or Hestia is a strong archetype within them. Hestia is one of the first goddesses from the Olympians, and She's actually the very first, and what makes her very different than all the other gods and goddesses in Greek mythology is that she's what we call non-personified. So, for example, even this image is not a statue of Hestia. It's a statue of what is called a head Vestal Virgin, and Vesta is the Roman name for Hestia. So, especially later in Rome, you had the fire temples, and then you had priestesses devoted to the goddess who lived inside the temples. And they were kind of, some of them were depicted, and there were statues made from them. But Hestia was not a goddess that showed up in myth a lot, or that you see a lot of paintings from or statues from. And that's why we call her non-personified, which is very rare. And that's probably for a reason. Because Hestia also, when we go deeper into the origin of words and language, Hestia means essence or presence. And it's kind of when we come back to the Jungian psychology and when we talk about the soul and the center. So we can kind of see Hestia as the center. So she doesn't really have a persona. So she doesn't have stories that boost her or that bring her out into the world, but Hestia has a lot more focus on her inner world. And her symbol is the hearth and the fire. And it's Hestia is in the candle we light out of a spiritual practice. It's also the fires at the temples, the ongoing fires, so the who are always tended. That is Hestia, and that's what happened in the original temples. That the fires of Hestia were always burning. And there are, even though she wasn't personified, so it seems like she's not one of the most important goddesses. When we have a deeper look at the culture, that's not really true. So, because every home had a hearth, and every heart, every temple has a fire, and also every common area that you had, the same as we have public areas nowadays, you also have that in ancient times. So these common communal or like political areas where people would come together, there will always be a fire or hearth at the center. And even when you had the main hearth in a capital city, when they would actually expand to another city, they would actually take the torch and the fire to light it in another place. And the same happened in homes. So there was this marriage rituals when a newlywed couple would go outside the house. They would take a fire from the mother house, you could say, and they would then bring it to the new house. And of course, then people didn't live that far apart. But it was an important ritual. So Hestia had importance in her own way without being visible. So Hestia is the invisible woman who's not personified, the same way as a priestess or a nun is not personified, because they kind of devote their lives to the deities or to God, and they kind of lose their persona or their self. And when we look more at daily life, women who are strongly influenced by Hestia, they feel very comfortable at home. And also, even doing chores in the house aren't really chores for them, or there aren't like to-do lists, as which is very Athena like, okay, I'm gonna do this and this and this. But Hestia is a lot more about seeing it as a practice, as a ritual. Um, so all these different rituals, as kind of burning incense, is also kind of a ritual that is part of Hestia. So, yeah. So also again, coming back to the Vestal Virgins, what is important to know is that Hestia is a name in ancient Greece, so it's the Greek name, and Vesta is the Roman name. And like what different people who studied classics, what they found is that there were actually temples in ancient Rome, and these are called the Vestal temples, and they were in honor of the goddess Hestia or Vesta. And there were actually very strict rules for these priestesses. So then they had to swear and take a vow to remain a virgin. And if they wouldn't keep that vow, they would be buried alive. So there were very strict rules around it because being a priestess to tending the fire in the sacred temples was really seen as kind of this divine or sacred task that was most important. So the priestesses literally gave up their personal lives in order to be a priestess. So it's a kind of an example of kind of really the devotion that women who are kind of strongly with these archetypes have. The same is kind of a woman who now joins a nunnery. She has to also give up all her personal possessions, or it is also the same in most other religions as well, where there is a sacrifice to live in devotion to spirit, to God, or to different deities. So the difficulties with Hesiod is not really, it's more, it's almost like Hesiod herself. She doesn't really have stories where she's portrayed negatively at all, because there are little stories about her. So when we talk about the difficulties, is more when we translate this archetype to modern life, where Hestia would have not as much relationship with the external world. She doesn't have any ambition. She doesn't care about it, actually. It's not important to her. The Hestia goddess archetype can be very withdrawn and even completely hidden. So, yeah, I think the more difficulty an Hestia woman in modern times can feel and experience is being invisible and not having many relationships, or where it's almost like she has connection and interaction, but there's no intimacy. There's no deep, close, intimate relationship that relates her strongly to another. So when we do look in the Greek archetypes, she does have a relationship with, which is kind of her polar opposite masculine type, is Hermes. And Hermes is actually the opposite of her. Hermes is a traveler and also a tradesman. So in that way, in that constellation, they complement each other. So also kind of in modern life, you would say that Hestia is someone who can have friendships with others, but she doesn't really have intimate relationships with others, and even friendships. She would probably be more the listening friend or the calm friend. So people wouldn't just know all these things about her. She would be more unto herself. And then we have another vulnerable goddess. Now we move on to the vulnerable goddesses, and then we move on to Hera. So Hera is the queen of the gods, and she's married to Zeus. So what's good to know is that Zeus had many different children, many different wives, and also cheated all the time. So he was not loyal to Hera at all. But Hera was kind of, you could say, his last and final wife. And Hera, so she's mainly known as the goddess of marriage and as a wife. So you could kind of also see Hera as the queen archetype, who is very influenced by status. So Hera women are also mainly concerned with status. Also recently I was watching, I sometimes like to watch this show. It's a lot of you might know it. It's called Bridgerton. So it's kind of also this show, this series where you have this importance on marriage and finding a suitor. So you have all these mothers and all these daughters that are all focused on getting married. So this is kind of an example of when the archetype of Hera is very strong. So the purpose for Hera, which is most important, is to find a man, and not just a man. Hera woman would usually go for a man of status. So it's kind of the old way of kind of marrying, not for love necessarily, even though love is important to Hera, but status would be more important. So it's women who look to marry into very good circumstances are often dominated by Hera. So for Hera, marriage is the most important. So what you see it in younger aspects in women, these are women who romanticize about marriage a lot, and already maybe have all their wedding plans in mind before they even turn like 12 or something. They already have in mind what they want and need. So that's kind of an example when Hera is already strong at a younger age, where it's really kind of at the forefront of someone's life and it's kind of the most important thing. So Hera is a woman that can also have her own career and things like that, but it's kind of marriage is what is most important. And these are women where the marriage can even be, but of course it's connected, be more important than the mother role. So these are women who want to spend actually most of their time with their husbands, for example, and that's very important. And this is why also Hera oversees the marriage ritual of the vows and of the whole day of the ceremony. During that time, Hera is very present. And on the positive side, what Hera can really activate within us is to form a strong bond with someone that's for the long term. So we don't give up when things get hard. And also to commit, to really commit. And instead of this fleeting energy, which you see a bit more with Aphrodite, for example, who doesn't really commit to one person. Hera does. The negative side of that can be to stay together. Well, it doesn't have to be negative, it's the perspective you look at it from, but to stay together for better or for worse. And Hera takes it very literally. So that means when you marry, kind of divorce is not really an option for those women. They don't see it as an option. So no matter what happens, or even, for example, when their spouse cheats or whatever happens, that would not be a reason for them to leave at all. They would work at the relationship at whatever costs to continue to make it work. So there are two sides to it. There's a very positive side with Hera of actually when we're transitioning into life from a different stage and different chapter where we actually are able to commit to a relationship for the long term. But this can also be in different areas of our life where we really commit to something. And the negative side is can be that we stay in a relationship or in a marriage no matter what the cost is. And also the difficulties Hera women experience is extreme jealousy, vengefulness. Also, for example, when their husband cheats, they will go after the woman more than the man is an example of that. So there can be a dependency on their husband that's very strong, and not necessarily dependent just financially, for example, but it can be a dependency for status, a dependency for approval to get their needs met. Because often hear that because they are easily jealous or all these different things, they often don't really have close female friendships at much because kind of their husband is always the most important thing. So kind of friendships always come later. And often when Hera has a lot of friendships, these are often what you see in life, a lot of these couple friends, that you have couples that often meet often and then they form a deeper friendships, but it's almost through them being a couple instead of individual friendships. And then we have Demeter, and Demeter is the mother goddess, and she's the goddess of the grain. I already spoke into it a little bit earlier. So Demeter's a vulnerable goddess because her archetype or her existence completely depends on being a mother. So this is also for women where motherhood is the most important thing in their life. So it's kind of the opposite of Hera. And an example that I just gave is for Demeter women, for example, when the child is born, they might completely forget about their husband or not even pay attention to their husband anymore because they're so focused on their role as a mother. For Demeter women, also being a mother is far more important than any career goals are, usually, unless there's another strong archetype. So Demeter is also known as the mother of Persephone. Persephone is her only daughter. And I don't have the time to go into today, but the reason why the hymn to Demeter and also the temple to Demeter was so well known is because of the Eleusinian mysteries. And the Eleusinian mysteries took place every year during the fall equinox. And later you also had the lesser mysteries taking place in spring. And the mysteries are about this story where Persephone, her daughter, gets abducted by the Lord of the Underworld. And then Demeter goes to grief near a temple. And she is grieving the loss of her daughter so much she stops the growth of all the crops because she is the mother of the grain. So the growing of the grain is dependent on her. And through that stopping in her grief, actually the season of winter is born. So the story of why the story is so important, kind of in mythology, but also in culture, is that the story of Demeter and Persephone is the story of the birthing of the seasons, so of the cycles of life and death. And it's also believed that during the Eleusinian mysteries, there was also there's a fungus that grows on grain that was also kind of infused. So basically, there was this yearly ceremony where people would take mind-altering substance in modern language, probably similar to effects to LSD, and they would have these extreme spiritual experiences. And even the greatest philosophers like Aristotle and Plato and kind of the greatest quote unquote minds of the time would all have an experience. And people would come from all over Greece and later from various places, as long as they spoke Greek, to have at least the experience of the Eleusinian mysteries once in their lifetime. So that's a very in-depth story and mystery, and it's called a mystery for a reason because people were actually not allowed to talk about their experience. But this does give Demeter a very important role. You could say Demeter is a matriarch. So actually, she's a vulnerable goddess because she's dependent on her role as a mother, and her well-being is very dependent on how her daughter is doing, like with most mothers. And that's why she's dependent, but she is actually one of the most powerful goddesses and influential goddesses when you look at Greek mythology because of the Eleusinian mysteries, but also because of her title as a mother goddess, similar to the importance of Isis, very well known in the Greek mythologies. The deep shadow side um, of Demeter is grief, and not just grieving, but not wanting to come out of that period of grief. So when it's kind of what we call like an all-consuming grief that leads to deeper depressions, and also a victimization of not wanting to do anything. So this is where she exercises her power by not letting the crops grow, her power and her wills, like I want to get my daughter back or nothing else happens. But at the same time, it also almost caused like such a great famine in on Earth that almost humanity died. So there are two sides to it. So the difficulty you see in kind of modern life, if we would translate it against to women's lives, is a woman so intent to fight with her mother role that she always has to be seen as a good mother. The shadow side of the mother archetype, which can also come through, is what we Jung calls the devouring mother, or the mother that overly fosters dependency of her children. This can be when mothers actually don't want to let their children grow up. It's almost like, especially this mother phenomenon is very strong, where parents kind of, or mothers like overly mother or smother their children, and they don't actually want them to be on their own. So it can also be, shadow side can also be controlling in the sense of withholding love at certain moments to exercise control. So there's also a shadow side to the mother as well. So on the one hand, she's very benevolent and abundant and sharing food and opening up her house and her door to take care of the children. On the other hand, when a woman takes it too far and or she doesn't allow her children to be their own being, for example. And also a woman who is very kind of strongly dominated by the Demeter archetype can also, what can also happen is that she experiences what is called empty nest syndrome. So is that when the children leave the house, it's kind of this emptiness feels so strong that she falls into a deep depression. So that's one of the difficulties women who are strongly dominated by that archetype can experience. And then we move on to her daughter, Persephone, who's in the maiden goddess, who is kind of just in the story, just on the verge of womanhood. And later she becomes, through that story, the queen of the underworld. So the story of Persephone is that when she was just on the verge of womanhood, like I said, she was captured by Hades, lord of the underworld, who is her uncle, abducted her and kept her stuck in the underworld. And so in that scenario, Persephone is the victim. When we translate it to other, like our own lives, is that these moments of adoption, it's not as abrupt, but even these can be stories of abuse that happen, where a woman feels, like she cannot do anything about the situation, or as a little girl, and she's kind of abducted into the underworld, meaning like she experienced traumatic experiences or something that's beyond her control. And this is when women strongly experience that archetype, is where they experience a state of victimhood, of not being able to change the circumstances or they're in. Well, later on in the story, actually, Persephone does make her way up to the upper world, but just before she does, she eats a pomegranate seed. That's why you also see it in the image, a pomegranate. And because she eats something in the underworld she was unaware of, but Hades did know, is that she was then bound to the underworld. And what that meant is that upon returning to the earth and to the upper world, she has to go back every year to the underworld again. And here we come back to the theme of the seasons. So Persephone is the goddess of spring and of fall. So every time during fall, she goes back to the underworld. And then we have winter, which is more the season of grief. And then we move back into spring, and which is more the season of abundance. And then we have then the summer, which is more Demeter season as well. So you see the summer and the winter are more the season of the mother and crone archetype. And then the spring and fall is more the maiden archetype. And because these are the transformative seasons, so that's why Persephone is also associated with transformation. And this story also comes back from, which you also see is after women experience traumatic experiences and they come back and move back up, what that creates within their, again, within their psyche, within their emotional world, and within the world of their soul, is that they're able to travel between worlds. And what that means is that often these women have a larger capacity to navigate their emotional world. And once they've really healed their own wounds, they can become a guide for others. So, this is what you often see with women, and can also be with men, but who've experienced great difficulty in their lives, and they were able to, through therapy or through going through their own healing process, they're able to come back to the upper world and the middle world. They're later able to guide others because they no longer fear the depths of the underworld. And that's how Persephone kind of becomes the queen, because she actually no longer fears the underworld. It has become her domain. So that's how we see how the Persephone, the archetype, can move from powerlessness, and kind of completely being passive, not being able to do anything about their situation, to actually being able, often through the help and guidance of others, be able to move back up again and later to become a guide for others. So, especially you have a lot of counselors and therapists and psychologists who've gone through very difficult things, and they often become the best at what they do later on in life because they had these negative experiences and were able to come out on the other side. So that's how that positive transformation can emerge. So the difficulties can be with Persephone when she gets stuck in the maiden girlhood. So the positive side of the eternal world is a kind of this eternal child glow. These are often women who look like they're not becoming any older. No matter how old they are, they stay very young. And the difficulties of the shadow side is staying more in a child state where, oh, I cannot actually change my circumstances. And that's what is meant by being held captive, is that, like what can help also women who have that archetype very strongly is also to activate archetypes who maybe are a bit more assertive, like Artemis, for example, that you can actually move forward and towards your goals instead of endlessly waiting. So the light side of that is that Persephone women can really stay with their feelings without needing to fix or change anything. So it is this unconditional presence that's often needed in therapy. The shadow side of that is just endless waiting, not making any decisions, which can provoke anxiety. Or also, one shadow side is dishonesty as well, because Persephone lied about eating the pomegranate seed. So yeah, so self-honesty also brings that archetype into balance, and then we can see what we can actually influence and change in our life. And then we moving on to the alchemical goddess, which is Aphrodite. And Aphrodite is the creative woman. And she's the lover, which of course she's very well known for. And often from Aphrodite, there's lots of statues, paintings, often naked. So Aphrodite is all about embracing the beauty of the naked body and of her sensuality, living in a moment, um, feeling our senses. So sexuality is essential for Aphrodite. So Aphrodite is the goddess who rules over the process of falling in love and feeling attractive and feeling sensual. So the one hand, she kind of rules over kind of the area of love, especially the moment when we fall in love and that kind of passion behind it. But on the other side, which is different, she also kind of controls or kind of influences lust. So this can be this feeling of sexual desire that's very strong, or even sexual desires can be experienced by Aphrodite that are inappropriate, for example, which can lead to all kind of complicated situations. Um, because Aphrodite is alchemical goddess. She's also the goddess of creativity, and very different than what we talked about earlier when it comes to craft with Athena. The creativity of Aphrodite is kind of a bit more like the opposite. It's very in the moment and very intense. It's kind of when we are obsessed with a creative project or something and we work on it very intensely. It's almost like I often have it with sometimes when you kind of forget to eat or you don't really want to pee, it's kind of, or where you kind of continuously work on it and you kind of forget everything else that's going on in your life. That's really Aphrodite at work. Aphrodite is also kind of the unique, expressive woman. This is makes her the alchemical goddess, where she does have relationships. She loves to be seen by others, to be the center of intention. It's not a problem to her. But she doesn't care as much about what other people think. So this makes her a bit more of an alchemical goddess in the sense where she does love the attention and relationships, and intimacy is very important to her. But it's almost like she's the woman that chooses. So she still really has agency in her life. And it's kind of, yeah, she chooses how she expresses herself and also who she chooses as a romantic partner. She's very multi-passionate. So Aphrodite's definitely a woman who can do many different things, changes her life often, changes partners often, maybe goes and lives in different places. So that kind of that unpredictability, not being controlled by others, that's really the energy of Aphrodite. So she's kind of prone to living a more unconventional life. The difficulties can be, because of her sexual nature, unplanned pregnancy or other things in that area, avoiding commitment, so having like more short-term relationships, infidelity, so cheating is a big one. Also, what can with Aphrodite sometimes makes female friendships difficult, especially a little bit more hero types who very value their relationships very much, is being seen as a threat, also because of her beauty. When women are controlled by Aphrodite purely more like physically for their looks, there can be a very strong fear for aging. So this can be a reason why women get plastic surgery and all these different things. It's kind of an expression of that fear. Yeah, so Aphrodite is a lot of energy, a lot of passion, unpredictable, but a very powerful goddess to work with, especially when we want to get in touch with our creative power, and also get in touch with our sensuality and sexuality. There's been Aphrodite at many temples for that reason. Um, and yeah, she also had both male and female lovers. So Aphrodite likes to just taste the full spectrum and kind of does whatever she wants. And then lastly, this is not part of the goddesses in every woman, but Hecate is part of the second book, like I said, in older women. But I think Hecate is an incredibly important goddess. And this also comment that, yeah, it's also a comment that Jean Bolin later made, and some of the critiques she received is that she didn't add Hecate onto the first book. Well, that aside, Hecate is a very important goddess, but she's not part of the Olympians. She actually predates the Olympians, so she was kind of of an older generation of gods, you could say. And this makes her a crone goddess. And she's often seen as the wise woman and the witness. And Hecate was why she's so important. And the critique was given to Bolin was because Hecate was also part of the story of the Eleusinian mysteries and the hymn to Demeter. Because Hecate is also known as a goddess of the underworld as well. Like it's also her domain, especially because the night is the domain of Hecate, and she's also associated with the moon for that reason. And she is more the wise woman and the witness. So also when Persephone came back from the underworld, and also during the time of grief, Hecate was actually the only one who came to help and who came to aid. So Hecate is often like an older woman, a wise woman who comes to the help and to the aid. So this can also be a mentor or counselor, for example, that helps women who've been through traumatic experiences or to guide them out of like that underworld and guides them back, or how to kind of return to their own agency. Hecate is kind of also the goddess of the, not kind of, she is the goddess of crossroads and the witch. So she is the strong, like the witchy archetype. So later in Roman times, she became the trivia goddess. So that's also where the name trivia comes from. It's kind of three. Hecate is ruled by the number three. So she's known by the fork in the road. So you have three different roads. So people have to decide which direction they go. Um, so often at these turning points, these important turning points, Hecate comes in. And she can also be kind of like a witch or a tarot reader, even to give guidance to someone when they have to make an important decision in their life. And they are not looking for like the normal advice, but kind of more the deeper psychic reasoning. So that's why Hecate can really become like a real witch, and even work as a psychic or medium. But it can also be in a role more also as a psychologist or counselor who, for example, also integrates astrology into their work. So it's often yeah, you could see Hecate is more often older woman or a very wise woman for her age who integrates also more maybe what we call occult practices or spiritual practices that bring us more in touch with like the spiritual aspects as well. So where intuition is used to gain information rather than logic. Yeah, but also any type of oracle readings, or that's kind of all in her domain. So, like I mentioned before, like really this descent is very important with Hecate. Hecate is kind of the one who, on the one hand, helps to kind of like with Persephone to help her to come back up. But she also, every time she descends again, she's also there to oversee that process. So, in the world of Hecate, the descent is not seen as something negative. Kind of in Hecate's world, positive and negative don't really exist. She kind of lives in between worlds. And what that means is that the descent is almost be seen from that perspective by this essential part of the process, and that sometimes we need to go into the underworld to retrieve something, or to know or to understand something, or to go through some type of deep initiation process. Yeah, so in that way, Hecate is very different and similar to Artemis, and Artemis and Hecate overlap. So their worship, so also the worship throughout from Artemis and Hecate are not only in the bigger cities or some specific islands, you see them all over the mainlands. And you see them spread not only in Greece, but also throughout the rest of Europe. So both Hecate and Artemis are not as limited to Greece alone or limited to the time period of the classics. So in that way, it's a bit more of a pagan goddess, you could say. And then the last thing I just want to share. So first of all, the Creative Book Club is coming up. If you would like to join, just let me know. And you can also find the information to join on the website. And there's also an early bird offering